It's funny. We all kind of throw around this word discrimination. Like, we all know what it means, right?
Great.
But when you actually try to, really define it, it gets kind of slippery. And when you bring in the whole philosophical angle, well, that just throws another wrench in the works.
It really is remarkable. You think about these really important human rights documents, like internationally, they talk all about discrimination, what you can't discriminate on, but they never actually define it.
That's so interesting. So they're telling you what not to discriminate on,
Yeah.
but not what it is to discriminate in the first place.
Exactly. And that right there is where the philosophy comes in.
Oh, yeah, totally. And that's what we're going to really get into today. So for you, our listener out there, you're philosophically minded, so you're going to love this. This idea of discrimination, it seems straightforward, but it's so much more complex. We're going to dig into all the philosophical arguments and the sticky points that philosophers have been grappling with for ages. It's a real deep dive.
Yeah, it might seem simple at first, like, oh, you're treating someone unfairly because of the group they're in. But as soon as you start peeling back the layers, there's just so much disagreement about what it actually means to discriminate. Like, even just starting with what is discrimination, that can send you down all sorts of philosophical rabbit holes.
Right. And to help us navigate all of this, we're turning to a really solid source, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They have this super in-depth entry on discrimination that we're going to be using. It's like our map for this philosophical journey. So how do we even begin to pin down this idea of discrimination in a way that makes sense philosophically?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia actually gives us this helpful starting point. They call it a first approximation. So basically they're saying as a first step, we can think of discrimination as these actions, practices, policies, the things people do that result in some kind of disadvantage, harm, or wrong to somebody. And the key here is that it's based on their membership in a socially salient group. So think about categories like race, religion, gender, those sorts of things.
Right. Socially salient. It makes sense. Like treating someone differently because of something as random as their, toenail length, which the encyclopedia mentions, obviously citing Lippert, Rasmussen, and Holroyd, it just doesn't carry the same weight. That's not discrimination in any meaningful way unless you're in some very specific toenail judging club.
Exactly. There are reasons certain group memberships matter more in a social context. They have historical baggage. They shape how people interact with each other, all that. But it is interesting that this idea of social salience itself gets challenged. Like Idelson says you don't even need that, which we'll come back to when we talk about why discrimination is wrong.
Okay, so we've got disadvantage, harm, and this idea of being in a group that matters socially. But the encyclopedia really emphasizes this landmark case, Brown v. Board of Education. For someone who wants to understand discrimination from a philosopher's perspective, why is this case so crucial?
Brown v. Board, it's all about the comparative nature of disadvantage. So the Supreme Court, they said segregating schools was unconstitutional because it was messing with black kids' education. It was holding them back from opportunities they'd have in integrated schools. The real philosophical takeaway here is the court wasn't just saying black kids were having a hard time. They were saying they were specifically at a disadvantage compared to white kids. It was about inequality within the same system, not compared to schools in other countries or anything.
So it's not just, are you suffering? But are you suffering more than others in your society because of your group? That's a key point for understanding equality, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this idea of comparison, it helps us understand the difference between just treating people differently and treating them in a way that's disadvantageous. Like with Jim Crow laws, they treated black people differently, yes, but the point is it put them at a disadvantage. White people were also subject to those laws, but it didn't harm them the same way. Discrimination, in the real moral sense, is asymmetrical.
It's not just about difference. It's about which direction that difference pushes you in, advantage or disadvantage, compared to others.
Right. And here's something really interesting, philosophically speaking. You can actually give someone a benefit, but if you give a bigger benefit to another group, then you're still discriminating. You're still creating this disadvantage, even if everyone is technically getting something. The example they use in the encyclopedia about Harvard's quota on Jewish students, it shows this perfectly. These students were still getting admitted, which is good, right? Yeah. But the quota put them at a disadvantage compared to their Christian peers just because they were Jewish.
Yeah, that makes you think about discrimination less as you get nothing and more like the game is rigged against you, even if you're still in the game.
Exactly. Now, of course, not everyone agrees with this whole relative disadvantage thing. Some philosophers, like Rayom, they say, well, hold on. If it's all about inequality, then wouldn't it be just as fair to make everyone worse off, level the playing field down instead of up? But Lippert Rasmussen has a good counterargument. He's like, look, making everyone worse off might be wrong, but it's not discrimination. Discrimination is about one group getting the short end of the stick compared to another.
So there has to be that reference point, that other group that's getting the better deal. You can't discriminate against everybody equally.
Exactly. That's why this idea of comparative disadvantage is so important. Now, the encyclopedia then makes this really crucial distinction between what they call the non-moralized and moralized concepts of discrimination. It's a little philosophical jargon, but it's really important for understanding how we think about this stuff.
Okay, let's break that down. What does it mean for discrimination to be moralized?
So, the non-moralized concept is basically just what we've been talking about, creating this disadvantage based on group membership. It's just describing what's happening without saying whether it's right or wrong. But the moralized concept, that's how we usually use the word discrimination. It already has that built-in judgment. It implies that what's happening is morally wrong. It's like Wasserman says, when you call something discrimination, you're already saying it needs a good justification.
So when we say discrimination in everyday conversation or even in philosophy discussions, we're usually talking about this morally charged version. We're not just describing a difference, we're saying it's unfair.
Exactly. And the key point is that this wrongness is specifically about the group you're in. Like, a bad economic policy might hurt certain people more than others, but that's not necessarily discrimination in this moral sense. It only becomes discrimination if it's directly tied to being a member of a socially salient group.
So being in that group is what makes the unfairness morally significant. And the encyclopedia then dives into the different types of discrimination, starting with direct discrimination. What are the philosophical hallmarks of that one?
Direct discrimination, it's basically saying we're going to treat this group worse and we're not even trying to hide it. It's that clear link between how someone is treated and their group membership. Like that case in Romania where they literally put up a sign saying, "We don't serve Roma." The exclusion is right there in your face, directly tied to being Roma. That's direct discrimination in a nutshell.
So it's not just about the bad outcome. It's about the blatant policy or the obvious reason why they're being excluded. But of course, it's not always that simple. The encyclopedia talks about situations where policies seem neutral but are actually intended to discriminate. How does that work?
This is where things get philosophically tricky. Sometimes that discriminatory intent is hidden behind a seemingly neutral policy. It's designed to achieve the same outcome, just in a less obvious way. The classic example is literacy tests during Jim Crow. These tests, on the surface, they didn't say anything about race, but they were put in place specifically to keep Black people from voting. Because of the history of denied education and the way these tests were applied, they disproportionately hurt Black voters. So the reasoning behind the policy, the intention of the lawmakers, was discriminatory, even if the policy itself looked kind of neutral.
It was like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah.
To really understand direct discrimination, you have to look beyond the surface, consider the historical context, and understand what they were really trying to do. But even then, the encyclopedia says it's not always about conscious, mustache-twirling evil intent.
Right. Lippert Rasmussen makes a good point. He says direct discrimination doesn't always have to be this deliberate, malicious thing. It can also come from just not caring about a certain group's interests. Like an employer might have hiring practices that, without them even realizing it, make it harder for women to get hired. It's not that they hate women. It's more like they just don't think about the impact. They're using criteria that are convenient or traditional, and they don't see the problem. Or they might have biases, even biases they think are good, like, oh, women shouldn't do this kind of work. It's too dangerous, that sort of thing.
It's like discrimination by negligence almost. And then there's unconscious bias, which the encyclopedia also brings up. That adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Oh, absolutely. You know, we're learning more and more about how our brains work, and unconscious bias is a huge factor in how we make decisions, even when we think we're being fair. Wax points out that sometimes even the intent to discriminate can be unconscious. So it's not always this clear-cut thing where someone is consciously choosing to be discriminatory.
That really complicates things, doesn't it? It's not always black and white.
Yeah.
So we've got direct discrimination, which can be out in the open, hidden, or even unconscious. Now let's move on to indirect discrimination. This one seems to cause even more philosophical headaches. What's the central puzzle here?
With indirect discrimination, the head scratcher is, how can a policy that seems totally neutral be discriminatory? Like, if it doesn't target any specific group on purpose, but it just so happens to have a worse effect on one group than others, that's what indirect discrimination is all about. And the European Court of Human Rights, in a case called Shanagan v. UK, they said even a general policy can be discriminatory if it has unfair effects on a protected group, even if that wasn't the intention. So philosophically, this challenges the idea that the person's mental state, their intention, is the most important thing for determining if something is wrong.
So it's not did they mean to do it, but what actually happened because of it. That's a big shift in focus. But the encyclopedia says there's no one agreed upon definition of when a disparate impact actually counts as indirect discrimination. What are some of the things philosophers and legal thinkers consider when trying to figure that out?
Yeah, so the question becomes, when does this unequal outcome cross the line from just a statistical thing to actually discriminatory? There are a bunch of different criteria out there. The ECHR, they talk about whether the policy has a good reason for existing and whether the means are proportionate to the ends. The UN's Human Rights Committee, they look for objective and reasonable criteria. The British Race Relations Act asks if the policy is justifiable regardless of the group it affects. And the U.S. Supreme Court, in Griggs v. Duke Power, they focused on whether the practice was actually related to the job. You see some common themes here, like is there a good reason for this difference in impact, and could they achieve the same goal in a way that doesn't discriminate?
So it's not just do the numbers show a difference. It's more like, does this difference make sense given the context?
Right. And the key idea, philosophically, is that if a policy is having a significantly worse impact on a specific group, then whoever's pushing that policy needs to show why that's okay. The burden of proof shifts. They need to show it has a good reason and that they couldn't do it any other way.
So it's like a red flag. Disproportionate impact doesn't automatically mean it's wrong, but it means you better have a good explanation.
And the encyclopedia keeps coming back to this Griggs v. Duke Power case. For a philosopher trying to wrap their head around indirect discrimination, what's so important about that case? Griggs is really important because it basically says, even if you can't prove someone meant to discriminate, the fact that a practice has a discriminatory effect can be enough to make it illegal. So, in this case, the power company required a written test for promotions. Sounds neutral enough, right? But it turned out way fewer Black employees were getting promoted because of this test. The Supreme Court said the test wasn't really measuring job performance, and they looked at the history of unequal education for Black people. So the point is, this seemingly neutral requirement was actually keeping inequality alive. It wasn't about intent, it was about the real-world impact.
So Griggs is all about looking beyond the surface at the historical context and the actual effects of a policy. It's saying fairness isn't just about treating everyone the same on paper. It's about recognizing the real disadvantages people face. Now, the encyclopedia moves on to organizational, institutional, and structural discrimination. This is where we zoom out even further, right?
Yeah, we're going big picture now. Instead of looking at individuals, we're looking at how discrimination can be baked into entire organizations or even society as a whole. So organizational discrimination, that's when a whole group, like a corporation or a university, is doing the discriminating. And philosophically, this raises the question, can organizations have intentions? Can they intend to discriminate?
And it seems like the answer is yes, right? The encyclopedia gives the example of, say, a university board making a deliberate decision to exclude Jewish students based on prejudice. That's not just individual bias, it's the organization itself acting with a discriminatory purpose.
Exactly. It's a group decision, not just a bunch of individuals acting on their own. And then we have structural discrimination, which goes even bigger. Thinkers like Turr and Hamilton and Pogge talk about this. It's about how the very rules and norms of society, like the legal system, education, housing, how all of that can systematically disadvantage certain groups, even if nobody is specifically trying to discriminate.
It's like the system itself is rigged, regardless of what any one person is doing.
Exactly. So while structural discrimination is often seen as a type of indirect discrimination because it's about the outcomes of those rules, it's often connected to a history of direct discrimination. Like, those structures weren't just created out of thin air, they were built on a foundation of intentional discrimination. But it's important to keep those separate conceptually, from a philosophical perspective.
Right. So we're distinguishing between the people who built the system and the system itself perpetuating the problem. But the encyclopedia is careful to point out that for something to be structurally discriminatory in this moral sense, it's not enough to just point to unequal outcomes. There has to be an underlying injustice as well.
Absolutely. Just because one group is doing worse than another doesn't automatically mean it's structural discrimination. Philosophically, you have to show that those unequal outcomes are the result of unfair principles or an unjust distribution of resources and opportunities.
So we're not just looking at numbers, we're asking, are these numbers the result of a system that's fundamentally unfair? Now, the encyclopedia throws us a curveball by dedicating a whole section to people who actually challenge the idea of indirect discrimination. What are their main criticisms?
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. You have these critics like Young, Kavanaugh, and Idelson who are basically saying, hold up, real discrimination has to be intentional. This whole indirect thing where you're just looking at outcomes, it's muddying the waters. They think discrimination should be about what's going on in the person's head, not just about the effects. They see it as conflating discrimination with more general social problems like oppression, which might not always involve intentional discrimination.
So they're worried that focusing on impact instead of intent is blurring important philosophical lines.
Right. Like Idelson, he says the very word discrimination implies that someone is aware of a particular characteristic and reacting to it. So if there's no awareness, no intention, then it's not really discrimination. Kavanaugh makes a similar point. He says, if you're worried about inequality, just talk about inequality. Don't try to squeeze it into the discrimination box.
And they have a point about how we use language, like phrases like based on or because of. Those can mean different things. Sometimes they refer to a person's actual reasons for doing something, which is what matters in direct discrimination. But sometimes they just explain a statistical pattern without implying any intention.
Exactly. They're saying using the same language for those two very different things is creating philosophical confusion. Basically, they see direct discrimination as a process-based wrong. Something is wrong with how the person is thinking. But indirect discrimination, to them, seems like an outcome-based wrong. It's about the statistics, not the thought process.
So they're saying, focus on the agent's mind, not just the end result. But the encyclopedia offers a counter-argument, right? Why do some philosophers think the idea of indirect discrimination is still important?
The defense is basically this. Indirect discrimination helps us see how even seemingly neutral actions can keep discrimination alive, especially when there's a history of direct discrimination. Like, going back to Griggs, the company's testing policy wasn't intentionally racist, but it was still putting Black employees at a disadvantage because of the history of unequal education. Indirect discrimination helps us connect those dots.
It's about recognizing that formal equality, treating everyone the same on the surface, isn't enough when there's already so much inequality baked into the system.
Exactly. And Jones, talking about religious accommodations, argues that indirect discrimination law is about creating genuine equality of opportunity. It's about making adjustments to account for the disadvantages people face because of their group. So even if there's no bad intent in the moment, the focus is on creating a more level playing field.
It's about taking responsibility for the past, even if you weren't personally involved. But even with all that, the critics are still worried about this shift away from individual responsibility and intentionality. And that leads us to the really big philosophical question. Why is discrimination wrong in the first place? The encyclopedia explores a ton of different answers, but it seems like there's no easy solution.
Yeah. This is where things get really deep, and it quickly becomes clear that there's no single knockdown argument that everyone agrees on.
Let's start with some of the more common explanations that sound good at first, but don't quite hold up philosophically.
Okay, so one idea is that discrimination is wrong because it's based on things people can't change, like their race or gender. But, like Boxall points out, we make all sorts of distinctions based on things people can't control, like we don't let blind people drive, and that seems justified. And even if you could change your race with some future technology, discrimination would still be wrong. Another view is that discrimination relies on stereotypes, which are often inaccurate. But in that VMI case, U.S. v. Virginia, the Supreme Court said, even if a stereotype is statistically true, you can't use it to deny individuals opportunities. Like, maybe it's true that on average, men are stronger than women, but that doesn't mean you can exclude all women from firefighting just because strength is important for the job.
Right, it's about judging individuals, not groups. So immutability and inaccurate stereotypes, those don't really cut it philosophically. What about the idea that discrimination is wrong because it's arbitrary or irrational?
This one's tricky. I mean, discrimination is usually based on prejudice, which is irrational, right? But some philosophers, like Gardner, point out that we don't always have a moral duty to be perfectly rational. And they give this example of a racist restaurant owner who only serves other racists because that's how he makes the most money. That might be rational from a business perspective, but it's still morally wrong. And Wasserstrom adds that this view ignores the bigger social context. Like, Racism is wrong not just because it's irrational, but because it's part of a whole system of beliefs that sees certain races as inferior.
So it's not just about one person's logic. It's about the whole social fabric that makes racism wrong. And then there's the argument that discrimination is wrong because it doesn't treat people based on merit.
Yeah, this is a popular one. Hook and Goldman are big proponents of this view. They say judge people on their abilities, not their group membership. But Wasserman points out, what does best qualified even mean? It's a really slippery concept. And Kavanaugh says meritocracy is often more about efficiency than fairness. Like, even if you hire the best people according to some metric, that doesn't mean you're treating everyone fairly, especially if there are systemic barriers preventing certain groups from reaching their full potential in the first place.
It's like saying everyone has an equal chance to win a race when some people are starting miles behind.
Exactly. Then you have the consequentialist perspective, where the wrongness of discrimination comes down to its overall negative consequences for everyone's well-being.
So it's like a utilitarian calculus, weighing the harms against the benefits.
Exactly. Arneson and Lippert Rasmussen are often associated with this view. They might argue that discrimination is wrong because it violates rules that, if everyone followed them, would lead to the most happiness or well-being overall. But there's a classic philosophical objection to this view. What if, in some bizarre scenario, discriminating against a certain group actually led to better outcomes for everyone? That doesn't seem right, and it shows that focusing solely on consequences might miss something morally important about the act of discrimination itself.
Right. Sometimes, even if the ends are good, the means can still be wrong.
Exactly. And then we have Moreau's perspective, which emphasizes the equal entitlement to freedom, particularly this idea of deliberative freedoms. Basically, she's saying discrimination is wrong because it limits our ability to make choices about our lives without having to worry about things like our race or gender as extra burdens. But some philosophers find that idea of normatively extraneous features kind of vague, and they wonder if it really captures the essence of what's wrong with discrimination.
So a lot of these attempts to pinpoint the wrongness of discrimination seem to run into problems. The encyclopedia then focuses on views that connect discrimination to the denial of equal moral status. This seems to resonate more with our moral intuitions, doesn't it?
Yeah, this feels like we're getting closer to the heart of the issue. So Hellman, she says discrimination is fundamentally demeaning. It's about expressing the idea that someone is less worthy of respect because of their group. Shin makes a similar point, saying that treating people unequally communicates the message that they're not entitled to the same level of respect. And this is echoed in the Obergefell v. Hodges case, where the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. They argued that denying same-sex couples the right to marry sends the message that they're somehow inferior, which is demeaning and stigmatizing.
It's about treating people as less than human, or less deserving of basic dignity. And then there's the close connection between discrimination and prejudice.
Right, the idea that discrimination is wrong because it's based on these negative, often unfounded beliefs about entire groups of people. So Ely focuses on the motivation behind discrimination being rooted in prejudice, while Dworkin says an action is discriminatory if you can't justify it without relying on prejudice. These views highlight the central role of prejudice in making discrimination wrong.
So it's not just about unequal treatment, it's about the mindset behind it. And then Idelson offers this pluralistic view where discrimination is wrong because it shows a lack of respect for the inherent value and autonomy of individuals.
Idelson's view is that discrimination fails to recognize the equal worth of all people and their right to make their own choices. But remember how we talked about Idelson's view not requiring social salience? That means his definition could potentially include a lot of things that we don't normally think of as discrimination. Like, even murder could be seen as a form of discrimination in a very abstract sense because it denies someone's right to life. And that leads to the question, if we stretch the concept of discrimination that far, does it lose its usefulness for understanding specific forms of social injustice that are connected to group membership?
It's like if everything is discrimination, then nothing is. So for a lot of philosophers, it's important to keep that focus on social groups. And this then shapes how we think about indirect discrimination.
Absolutely. When we think about structural discrimination, it's about how the institutions of society create disadvantages that are specifically tied to group membership. This can lead to whole groups being more vulnerable to exploitation, which is what Sunstein's anti-caste principle is all about. And McKinnon talks about how these structures keep women in a subordinate position. So The wrong here isn't just about inequality, it's about how that inequality contributes to broader patterns of injustice and power imbalance.
It's about how those seemingly neutral rules and practices end up keeping certain groups down.
Exactly. And then non-structural indirect discrimination, like in the Griggs case, is wrong because it reinforces those existing disadvantages. It might not be intentional, but it's still perpetuating the problem.
So even though indirect discrimination focuses on outcomes, we can still trace it back to problems in the process, whether it's the way society is structured or the way organizations operate.
Right. The encyclopedia is arguing that both direct and indirect discrimination involve flawed processes. Direct discrimination, it's a flaw in the individual's reasoning. They're judging people based on their group instead of seeing them as individuals. And structural discrimination, it's a flaw in the system itself, where these supposedly neutral rules end up creating disadvantages based on things that shouldn't matter.
This brings us to another really thorny issue. Which groups actually count when we talk about discrimination? As we see with ongoing debates about LGBTQ+ rights, this is not a settled question.
Yeah, this is where the philosophy gets really intertwined with politics and social values. The encyclopedia acknowledges that there's no easy answer to this question of who deserves protection from discrimination. And it brings up an interesting but often overlooked question. Can members of dominant groups be discriminated against?
It seems counterintuitive, right? Because discrimination is usually about power imbalances. But is it possible for someone in a privileged position to be discriminated against because of their group?
Some philosophers, like Scanlon, say no. He has this unidirectional view of discrimination where it's specifically about groups that have been historically excluded and denigrated. Fiss focuses on the idea of perpetual subordination. So the idea is that the whole point of the concept of discrimination is to address these systemic injustices faced by vulnerable groups. But the encyclopedia also points out that even people in subordinate groups can have prejudices, and they can act on those prejudices to deny opportunities to members of dominant groups. The scale of the problem might be totally different, but the underlying wrong, judging someone based on their group instead of their individual merits, could arguably apply in both directions.
So maybe it's not just about which group is on top, but about the principle of not treating people differently based on their group in the first place. But as the encyclopedia concludes, the concept of discrimination itself doesn't tell us which groups should be protected. That's a matter of broader moral reasoning and political debate.
Exactly. Discrimination gives us a framework for understanding a kind of wrong, but it doesn't dictate which groups should be included in that framework.
Given all these complexities and disagreements, the encyclopedia then asks, what good is the concept of discrimination anyway? What does it actually do for us?
They argue that the concept came about to help us make sense of these large-scale injustices that target entire groups of people. It helps us see the group-based nature of these wrongs, even though the harm is ultimately experienced by individuals. It allows us to name and challenge situations where people are treated as less worthy or more vulnerable simply because of who they are.
But Young criticizes this, saying discrimination is too narrow a concept to capture deeper forms of injustice, like exploitation and marginalization.
The encyclopedia acknowledges that discrimination might not be the right word for truly horrific things like slavery and genocide. That's why we have terms like genocide to capture the unique horror of those acts. But they also argue that discrimination, especially when we're talking about systemic discrimination, is often deeply intertwined with those other forms of injustice. Like those systems of exploitation and marginalization often target specific groups, so discrimination is a key part of how those systems operate.
And then we have the concept of intersectionality, which adds another layer of complexity.
Right. Crenshaw introduced this idea, and it basically highlights the fact that people can belong to multiple marginalized groups at the same time. And their experience of discrimination isn't just the sum of the individual discriminations they face. It's something more complex, like a Black woman might experience discrimination differently than a white woman or a Black man. It's about how those different identities intersect and create unique forms of disadvantage.
So it challenges the idea that we can just analyze discrimination based on one category at a time.
Exactly. It's a huge challenge for philosophical analysis because it means there's this potentially infinite number of ways people can experience discrimination. But even with all this complexity, the encyclopedia argues that the concept of discrimination is still valuable for understanding and fighting against injustices that are based on group membership, even if we need other tools to fully grasp the nuances of each individual's experience.
And finally, the encyclopedia tackles this really tough issue of religious liberty versus anti-discrimination laws. This is something we see playing out in society all the time.
It's a classic clash of rights. You have the right to freedom of religion bumping up against the right to be free from discrimination. And there's no easy answer, especially when it comes to things like religious exemptions from anti-discrimination laws. Like in the U.S., the Hosanna-Tabor case established this ministerial exception, which is a whole other philosophical can of worms.
And we see this debate playing out in all sorts of areas, like whether the Catholic Church should be forced to ordain women, or whether wedding vendors can refuse service to same-sex couples based on their religious beliefs.
Right. There are strong arguments on both sides. Some philosophers, like Chambers, are really adamant that gender equality should apply even within religious institutions. Laborde says it's okay to have limited exemptions for groups that are truly committed to a specific set of beliefs, but she thinks the Hosanna-Tabor ruling was too broad. Watson and Hartley say forcing the Catholic Church to ordain women in a society that values religious freedom is a step too far. But they strongly oppose exemptions for things like wedding vendors discriminating against same-sex couples, arguing that it creates a kind of second-class citizenship. And then Vallier offers a more accommodating view, saying these exemptions can be justified if they don't harm others and if alternative services are available. He puts a lot of weight on the importance of protecting religious beliefs.
So it boils down to this fundamental question of what we owe each other in a diverse society. Yeah. How do we balance individual rights with the need for equality and respect for everyone?
Exactly. Watson and Hartley prioritize civic equality and non-discrimination in the public sphere, while Vallier is more focused on protecting religious practice, especially when it doesn't create practical problems for others. It's a really tough philosophical dilemma with no easy answers.
Well, this deep dive has certainly been a journey. It's amazing how much philosophical depth there is to this concept of discrimination. Even though there's no single definition everyone agrees on, and even though there are all these different types and challenges, it's clear that discrimination is still a crucial concept for understanding and addressing a fundamental kind of wrong. It's about recognizing that treating people differently based on their group, denying them equal moral status, that's something we need to constantly be on guard against.
Absolutely. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've untangled different ways of defining discrimination, looked at the tricky relationship between intention and impact, explored all these different philosophical arguments about what makes discrimination wrong, and wrestled with how to balance anti-discrimination with other important rights.
It's a lot to think about, and that's precisely what we want you to do, dear listener. As you reflect on everything we've discussed, what do you think is the most fundamental wrong at the heart of discrimination? And how can we, as a society, best address that wrong in a way that's both principled and respects the diverse values and rights of all our members? It's a question that deserves our continued attention and careful consideration. We hope this deep dive has given you a more nuanced and philosophically informed perspective on this vital issue.
Absolutely. It's an ongoing conversation, and we hope you'll continue to engage with it.